So I finished the book last week. It was outstanding. I decided to reach out to you. I've been listening to the podcast. I just love getting the historical perspective of someone who's done their homework. And I think a lot of people would be shocked. I just had a conversation last week with someone that I've known for a long time who I didn't realize was a student of history and has read every autobiography they can get their hands on about presidents. I said, well, who's your favorite? Who do you like? They said, Lincoln, far and away. Lincoln, best one. Well, why is that? Well, because he saved the Union. We wouldn't have United States of America today if it wasn't for Lincoln. In your book, he gets floored, lambasted, just destroyed in terms of constitutional behavior. So let's start with Lincoln and make your case. Why this person?
Well, first of all, that statement that he said we wouldn't have the United States, it's completely not true. In fact, you would have had the United States minus 7 states originally. So there wouldn't have the Deep South. And Lincoln's actions going into the war led to other states leaving the Union. In fact, 6 other states. So the Union government still existed. You still had all your financial houses, your army, your navy, your government. The Congress hadn't dissolved. So you would have had the United States. But when you look at the Constitution, what Lincoln did, first and foremost, he had no formal declaration of war. Now, Lincoln got around this issue by saying, well, these states are in rebellion. But if you look at it that way, then he would have needed permission from the states themselves to send in the army. And he didn't have that either. So he's in this very, very interesting gray area about what he could actually do constitutionally when it came to the war itself. Other than that, when you look at all the other things that happened during the war, first of all, you had 30,000 northern civilians arrested for opposition to the Lincoln administration. So he's suppressing civil liberties across the United States. If you look at much of the legislation that was signed and put into effect during the war, for example, the National Banking Acts, which are constitutionally dubious. So we have a central banking system, again, because of that. But you've got an income tax, which was declared unconstitutional, that he signed into law. So there's all kinds of things going on here constitutionally that are problematic. And then, of course, it's always, well, okay, you could say that, but he had to do that because of the war. And then he freed all the slaves. Well, when you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, there was actually a Supreme Court justice named Benjamin Robbins Curtis. Now, he had left the bench by this point, but he's from Massachusetts. He's an abolitionist. And he said, look, this thing is completely unconstitutional because what you're doing here is basically saying, because of the war, I can do this. And Curtis said, if you do this, you're going to open up a Pandora's box that can never be closed, because what will happen is every president in the future will say, because we're at war, I can do X, Y, and Z. And that's exactly what's happened in the future in the 20th century. So war has precipitated most often our suppression of civil liberties. And Lincoln was the one who really started that process back in the 1860s.
It's been a crisis that we don't let go to waste, isn't it? Waging war.
Exactly right. I mean, so if you look at even moving forward to Roosevelt, I don't know if you're going to ask me about him, but if you look at what Roosevelt said, Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, everything was a war. The Great Depression, we got to go to war against the Depression. We got to go to war against the Nazis or the Japanese. But every time we did that, we lost a little more of our civil liberties. So, and of course, federalism in this true nature of the general government. So when you look at war, it's disastrous when it comes down to real constitutional government. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to ask you about Roosevelt, or both Roosevelts, as a matter of fact. I think Lincoln's the one I wanted to focus on, though, because you garnered praise on your book in terms of crossing over the ideological spectrum. And one thing I definitely want to ask you about today, I'm seeing so many people who are learning about history, trying to figure out what liberal meant back then versus conservative, what they mean now, the whole delusion behind the switch of the parties. I kind of look at it in terms of, look, there are people who prefer living life one way and looking at others a certain way, and they like liberty or they don't. And maybe that's a little too simplistic, but I want to get into the shift in ideologies. Even, just as another example, you talk about Calhoun a lot and his feud with Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. Well, Calhoun was on the side of the Constitution during a lot of the debate in your book, but he was also a horrible racist Southerner. Right. He was like Obama's, typical white grandmother. He was a bad guy in a lot of ways. So how do you reconcile those differences?
Well, I mean, I look at the 19th century this way. Everyone was a racist in the 19th century. And we're going to pick and choose, we're going to like this guy or not like this guy because of their views that were common for the time. And we would have to say the same thing about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or any of these people. I mean, they were what they were, men of their times. Calhoun was a slaveholder. He did defend slavery. He defended it as the basic structure of their economy in the South. And so I believe you can separate those things. Calhoun can say some great things about government and the nature of federalism and the role of the states. And you can say these things and you can say you like these things without having to say, well, yeah, I agree with Calhoun on slavery. Obviously, we don't. We live in a time when that would not be acceptable or is morally wrong. So looking back at it, I think the best way to say is that, Calhoun said some really perceptive things about the nature of the general government and the Constitution, and we should pay attention to that. And I think that for a long time, Calhoun was recognized as someone who was important. Even John F. Kennedy, in his book Profiles of Courage, talked about John C. Calhoun as one of the great U.S. senators. So it's only been the last 50 years or so that we've really seen this shift. Well, you can't talk about that guy because he was a racist or he was pro-Southern or whatever it is. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, and we're being damaged in the process. When you say that, you basically say we can't talk about anybody before 1975 because up until that point, only in the last 30, 40 years have we had a situation where most people have said, look, we disavow racism and slavery. That's a relatively recent thing in American history.
When we started tearing all the monuments down, right?
Right. It's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah. So in terms of some of the things that you said that really stood out, the first one was the 100 years. Every president over the last 100 years to be impeached. You also said that the founders felt that an out-of-control government or executive was the biggest bane to freedom. That was something I hadn't heard before. So expound on that a little bit.
Well, sure. If you look at the Philadelphia Convention and the ratifying debates, which when you talk about the original Constitution, this is a key term. What do I mean by that, the original Constitution? That's the Constitution that was ratified in 1787 and 1788. Not the one the Supreme Court twisted and the Congress twisted and the executive branch twisted, but the one that was sold to the states when it was going through ratification. The one that everyone said, look, this is how we're going to adhere to the Constitution. Ratify it, trust us. We're not going to abuse power. We're not going to abuse the document. And so when you look at those ratifying debates and you look at the Philadelphia Convention itself, when the idea of a single executive was proposed, everyone sat in stunned silence. Wait a second here. You're wanting to talk about a king again? Because this is what people were thinking. We're going to have another king? No way. We just fought a war against that. We don't want that again. And so they had a considerable debate on the powers of the executive branch. And what's really interesting, Madison made a very perceptive statement during the Philadelphia Convention when he said, look, the president is simply going to execute the laws that the Congress passes and do other things that are not, quote, legislative or judicial in nature. So when you look at that statement, basically what he's saying is the Congress will pass laws, the president will put those into effect, and he doesn't even have control of the sword, unlimited. The Congress has control of that. He doesn't have control of the purse because Congress has control of that. So all the president was going to do, Roger Sherman and John Rutledge, they all said the same thing. He's just going to execute the laws. And as you go to the ratifying debates, this is exactly how it was sold to the states. So as you move forward, and really the greatest villain in this process of expanding presidential power very quickly was Alexander Hamilton, because he had Washington's ear and Washington trusted him. And so you start looking at some things that happened in that process. And even Washington was off the rails in his second term in particular about what he was doing in terms of executive power. So the founding generation, during the time when the Constitution was ratified, were very afraid of a president that could turn into a king. And George Mason said, we don't want an elected king, but that's exactly what we've gotten here in 2016.
Makes me a little sad to hear that George Washington went off the rails. Doesn't a piece of the American inside you die to know that even Washington started to slip a bit? Yeah,
well, Washington is one of my favorite characters in history, and you can't see it behind me. I have a bust of George Washington. I love George Washington. But, when I wrote that chapter, and this is where people, I said, look, I wrote chapters on people that I like, that I had to take them apart. And even when you go back and look at the Washington administration, there were opponents of George Washington at that time. James Madison was opposed to some of the things he did. Thomas Jefferson was opposed. So oftentimes the critics of an administration are perceptive when it comes to when the president is abusing power. We need to listen to that. Even the people that we like need to go back and look at it objectively and say, well, maybe they had something to say there. Maybe they were right about this. And Washington's action with the Whiskey Rebellion were unconstitutional. Of course, he was following the law at the time, but the law itself was unconstitutional. So I take him to task for that. I take him to task for his neutrality proclamation, which was a unilateral move by the executive branch, which was not constitutional. So he's setting up some very dangerous precedents that other presidents are going to follow, namely Andrew Jackson next, and then on to Lincoln and on down the line.
Well, I know that I've told people that Thomas Jefferson on his deathbed or near about was worried that the country had already been lost, right? 50 years later. And I wonder what he would say today if he were here.
Oh, well, oh my gosh, you'd say we got to secede. We've got a government that's worse than what we had in 1776. What are we doing? You're paying outrageous taxes. You've got no power at the state and local level. The general government does whatever it wants, and it doesn't even give you a constitutional argument anymore. I mean, we don't even ask that of our elected leaders. Is that constitutional? And they'll just laugh. Oh yeah, of course it is, because we say it is. I mean, what else is there to say? So it's amazing how far we've gotten in 250 years or so.
I was surprised early on in the book how much time you spent or how much focus there was on the conversations around this idea of having an executive leader, a single person. And I guess we take it for granted today because we don't know nearly as much about it as we should. But you had one quote where you said the executive branch was looked at as the fetus of a monarchy, right?
Right.
You also said that today, I think King George III never had the kind of power the president has today. And just the idea of all these smart statesmen coming in and saying, this is horrible, it's a recipe for disaster, and let's talk about it. And it went on for a long time.
Yeah, it has. You're right. That fetus of monarchy quote is great, and it came out of the Philadelphia Convention. But when you look at the executive branch and you look at the powers that George III had, and we compare them, George III, and Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist 69, well, look at the powers that George III has. He can make war unilaterally. He has complete control of the purse. He has an absolute negative, all the things that we don't have in the Constitution. But when you look at what the president does today, he can make war unilaterally. He has power of the purse because the president proposes a budget through the Office of Management and Budget. The Congress just works off of that. He basically has an absolute negative on a law because, how many times can a veto be overridden? Rarely at all. So we have an executive branch that has the same exact power, if not more, than George III. And so we have executive government. The Congress has punted its responsibility over and over again. The states can't stop it. So what are we going to do? The Supreme Court is complicit. They said Obamacare is constitutional, and it's obviously not. But this is what the Supreme Court's working in concert with the executive branch, and it's amazing how we really don't have any checks anymore. And I think that's you're right, a sad state of affairs. If the founding generation could see this, they would have said, "We're not ratifying that document because this is what we're going to get."
But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.